Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Jonathan Baker, the head of the science unit at the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Science and Culture in Europe, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the IBC on Environment and Climate Change, and the three co-chair organizations, UNEP, UNEC, and UNESCO. Thank you very much for joining us today for the training. This is the third webinar in this training series on approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change in UNSDCFs, focusing today on the Southeast Europe and Turkey subregion. Many thanks for having answered our questions on mainstreaming prior to the training. This has been really helpful for us in developing the program to make sure that the training is demand-driven. The guidance for mainstreaming environment and climate change in UNSDCFs is the product of a fruitful collaboration between the 18 member agencies of the IBC with the support of DCO, whom I would like to take the opportunity to thank for their support. The guidance was released in June last year, and at the launch event in July, we are anticipating these coming trainings and on how to use this guidance and exchange with you about the focus of the training. The guidance responds to the request by RCs in the Europe and Central Asia region and hopefully meets your demands. The overall purpose of the mainstreaming guidance is to support integration of the environment and climate change in cooperation framework programming cycles. The guidance looks at mainstreaming in CCAs and cooperation frameworks within specific sectors and cross-cutting areas. Entry points identified for mainstreaming include the country framework roadmap, CCAs, as well as cooperation framework design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. The guidance provides a set of recommendations, good practices, as well as approaches and tools and guiding questions and checklists. So the first training event of this series was held in December last year and introduced the guidance and provided opportunities to exchange knowledge on mainstreaming within and across the three subregions. A wide range of colleagues from UNCTs from the majority of UN programming countries in the pan-European region attended. And you can find the recording of the first training invitation for today's session. So the training you're attending today is part of a series of 3 sub-regional level trainings being held this January. The first such session focusing on Central Asia was organized last week. The session on Eastern Europe and Caucasus is scheduled for next week. And the results of the 3 sub-regional trainings will be shared with all of you. So today's session aims to increase your understanding of the entry points, the practical approaches, and the tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation framework cycles. So we've structured today's session to be as interactive as possible, and we look forward to your active participation. I'd like to thank in advance our colleague from Serbia for joining us today and sharing their experiences with us in one of the breakout rooms. In a moment, our training facilitators from the International Institute for Sustainable Development will provide an overview of the virtual workshop and discuss the objectives of the training. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues from IISD and our consultant, Henrietta Martinekova, for working with us to develop this training workshop. With this, I would like to invite Livia from IISD to provide an overview of today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. So my name is Livia Bizikova. I'm a lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. And as Jonathan mentioned, we are the facilitators of this workshop, virtual workshop. So for us, it's a really great pleasure to have an opportunity to work with you and do the exercises and have a discussion about mainstreaming. We've been working on mainstreaming for many, many years, but not exactly in this region. So for us, it's really a great pleasure to use our tools and to have an interaction about how, from your needs, your perspective, and your day-to-day work, mainstreaming and the approaches that we will be using today can help to improve your work and address very important and urgent issues around environmental degradation, climate change, and other related issues. So that's what will be the focus for today. And so as Jonathan said, this training has 2 parts. The first one was in December for everybody. So it was a big group and it looked at the entry points of mainstreaming, and there were also some discussions about how this plays out in different regions. And today we will have a separate session for your region to look at approaches and tools and work together in 2 working groups on applying these tools. all the process, the presentation, the tools, and all the details that we will be discussing today is based on the mainstreaming guidance document that Jonathan mentioned earlier. So today, next slide, please. We will have a 2-hour session, same as it was for the first time, those of you who joined the first time. And today we do a deep dive on actually how to do mainstreaming instead of talking about why to do mainstreaming and how to start doing mainstreaming. So now we are really looking at to help you when you design documents, when you contribute to diverse development, framework documents, or other types of materials on how to actually do mainstreaming. So the process will be of the workshop is structured around the guidance material, and Henrietta will be presenting different parts of the guidance material throughout this session. But the second half of the session, we will have 2 working groups, and we will focus on, the first one will focus on risk analysis, linkages, and also around implementation. And the second one focus more about how to design indicators and how to incorporate measurement and assessment, measurement and evaluation into the design of the documents. After these 2 sessions, we will have a plenary where we kind of share briefly the outputs of these activities, next steps, and closing. So you will have a choice to decide which working group you would like to attend. And once we get closer, you can make your decision depending also the presentations that you will hear before that. So now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Darren Swanson, who is a long-term associate with IISD, and he is the co-facilitator of this event with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Livia. And Jonathan, thank you also for setting up today's event and noting that this is going to be an interactive event today. So we will have at the end the opportunities to provide some feedback through some polls that we've set up. You will have opportunity to ask questions during the presentation and the breakout group sessions. We're going to relieve you of the stress of quizzes today, though, and give you a break on that to allow a bit more time for discussion. And we have, as Livia noted, the breakout rooms that will be set up about midway through the webinar today. And so Jonathan had introduced that we had posed some questions during the registration phase to learn a bit more about the interests of all of you. And on this particular slide here is just a word cloud of the one question that was asked about the issues that are of concern for you right now, the environment and climate change issues that are of a focus that you're working on right now in terms of mainstreaming aspects. So if you just take a moment to scan that, you'll of course see that climate change came up resoundingly across a lot of the issues that were mentioned by participants. But we do have a lot of various combinations of climate change, whether it's in education, environment and climate change, or agriculture and climate change, health and climate change. But we have a lot of other issues too, that dealing with energy efficiency, just transition, biodiversity, waste management, green economy, air pollution were mentioned frequently by all of you. So thank you for that information, and this provides pretty good context for where discussions will be, I think, focused contextual, at least, in the breakout room sessions. We also asked you in advance of the session about what stage of the cooperation framework process are you most interested in more guidance on how to mainstream environment and climate change issues. So there are a number of entry points that were discussed in the first webinar for mainstreaming. And a lot, as you can see from the screen, that the majority of participants are interested in learning about guidance in the design and implementation and the monitoring and evaluation of cooperation frameworks. So we have modified the adjusted today's session to help focus on those parts of the cooperation framework to respond to the needs of the region. So you will see in both breakout rooms tools that really help to gain traction on mainstreaming in both design and implementation, but also they touch on monitoring, evaluation, and also into the common country analysis. So I think without further ado, we're going to launch right into our first part of the webinar to learn more about the guidance document, the approaches and the tools and the guidance document. And we have with us today Henrietta Martinekova, who was the lead author of the mainstreaming guidance document that you all had access to. Henrietta is an environmental and governance impact assessment specialist based in the Slovak Republic. She has experience with strategic environmental assessments, poverty, environment nexus, mainstreaming, analysis, gender, environment, and energy links, and also in measures for greening post-COVID-19 recovery. So Henrietta, thank you very much for being here today to share the guidance document, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Darren. Can you hear me well, everybody? Okay, so thank you very much, and greetings to all participants from Bratislava, Slovakia, where the snow blizzard just started. As it was mentioned already by Olivia, the major part of the workshop or the training is supposed to be devoted to interactive sessions, to the breakout rooms where you would have the opportunity to share experience and ask questions related to the challenges you are facing in designing or implementing the cooperation framework. So I will just very quickly run you through some approaches and methods and tools for mainstreaming. These will be the methods for all the 5 entry points of the UN programming process. I would start with saying that there is no single best approach or method. There is a number of approaches, methods, and tools that could be used. Therefore, as in the guidance itself and today's presentation, I would present only selected examples of some tools and methodologies. But whatever methodology or tool is selected, it should be determined by the programming process itself and by the character of the programming document. So, for example, if the programming document is cooperation framework document, its structure and especially level of details will be different from, for example, agency country program, or very different from the project document. So I think the type of the methodology and tool you use would correspond with that. Since the time for elaboration of the CCA and the cooperation framework document is rather short, it is 6 to 9 months. Usually in these methods, you would use existing data and information. So you would not run some research to get primary data. Also, in order not to prolong and overcomplicate the design of the CCA or cooperation framework document, you would try to select the simplest possible method, so you make the whole process of mainstreaming time and cost effective. And last but not least, the compendium package for cooperation framework design already includes large number of methods and tools. So for in mainstreaming terms, it's not necessary to come with the new tools just to possibly extend the already applied methods with bringing in the environment and climate change related substance. Yeah, in an example of extension of the method that is already used is stakeholder analysis, where you simply just try to make sure that in your stakeholder mapping and stakeholder analysis, you identify the right stakeholders who can, on one hand, push for mainstreaming or champion mainstreaming, and on the other hand, to provide necessary technical information. You identify who those stakeholders are, what should be their role in what stage of the UN programming process, and how you would involve them. Again, during the roadmap preparation, it would be very important to make the case for climate change and for climate change environment mainstreaming. you would try to do it as simply as possible. You would try to bring simple but clear messages in the forms of, for example, infographics, policy briefs, and fact sheets to emphasize those necessary linkages that should be reflected in the CCA and cooperation framework document design. We are moving to the design of country canon analysis, which is a very important base for designing the cooperation framework. One of the key very first steps during the CCA design is to identify what are the links between environment and climate change issues relevant for the country and for the sub-region, and the country priority development areas. For this identification of linkages, you can use simple metrics of synergies. You can see the example on the screen, where in the column you have priority country environmental and climate change issues as air pollution, loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. And in the rows, you have priority so-called non-environmental issues, as for example, transport improvement, agriculture, circular economy, which I see is much of the focus in a Serbian cooperation framework document, public fiscal reform, or improved strategic planning. Your number 0 would mean that there are not very strong linkages, so there is no need to waste time and capacity to deal with those issues. And number 1 would show that there would be strong linkage, and it would be need to include information on those linkages throughout the whole CCA document. Of course, while keeping in mind that you are trying to strengthen synergies, but also avoid duplications. In the section of CCA where the priorities and commitments are being identified in terms of mainstreaming, it is important that the official commitments and national priorities for environment and climate change are being included in the CCA, including the commitments to the multilateral environmental agreements, EU accession chapters and standards which are relevant for this region, and other international standards. It is important not to only say to which agreements a country has committed to comply with, but also, if possible, to include quantified commitments. In the CCA section, where the status of SDGs and targets important for the country are being assessed, in terms of mainstreaming, again, it would be important to provide an overview of status of SDGs and targets related to the environment and climate change throughout the whole SDG framework. It means also for the SDGs that are not specifically focused on environment. On the screen, you can see the example from CCA of North Macedonia, which is a really great example, because out of 17 SDGs that they identified, they refer to environmental climate change targets in 13 of them. For example, to the SDG on health, SDG on gender equality, SDG on good governance, and so on. In the risk assessment part, which each CCA includes, again, in terms of mainstreaming, it is important not only to identify what risks for the development priorities would be caused by the climate change and environment, but also vice versa, what country development priorities, non-environmental development priorities, what risk they could pose for in terms of environment and climate change. On the screen, you can see again example from Serbian CCA, which, for example, in terms of risk risk related to public health, they identify that air pollution and other pollutants could affect public health, including smoking. So they identify air pollution as one of the risk factors. And for economic stability and growth, they, for example, state that limited development of financial sector makes firms unable to access funds needed for the transition to green and sustainable economy. This is just an example of how UNDP social environmental screening procedure guidance provides the guidance how could the risk be measured in terms of magnitude and likelihood. Next slide, please. I think here we go to the questions and answer, right?
Yes, thank you, Henrietta. So we get the first set of slides from Henrietta, and now we have a few minutes for questions. So is there any question from the audience? Please, you can put it into the chat or you can raise your hand, and we can ask Henrietta to respond to the question right away. And then we move to the next set of slides. Maybe in the meantime, you mentioned, Henrietta, that it will be important to look at mainstreaming environment and climate change into non-environmental development objectives, or SDGs. So from those non-environmental, what would be the most important ones so that the country doesn't miss an opportunity to address the environment if they have to prioritize?
I wouldn't say what would be the most important ones. It depends also on the development priorities of the countries themselves and about the level of linkages and what risks actually could those development priorities mean for environment and climate change, or how could they be affected. But maybe I would like to point out some development priorities that are not that obvious when it comes to linkages with environment and climate change. For example, when you have SDG 16 on the good governance, it is very important that when we support institutional reforms or public fiscal reforms in the countries, we also have in mind that good governance is very important to manage correctly the natural resources and to decrease pollution. So, for example, it is important to me to think of how to introduce or improve tools like public procurement, green budgeting, introducing green taxes, green bonds already where possible. Yeah, so this is an example. Or for example, education, also SDG on education. If we are supporting countries in educational reform in terms of curricula, I think it's also important to think of building the knowledge and skills for promoting sustainable development.
Thank you. I think these are great examples, and definitely the governance system often shortfalls on the side of the environment. Maybe if we can get a quick reflection from Henrietta on the linkages between climate action and just transition, for example, in the context of green jobs, and how that would play into from the mainstreaming angle.
Example would be in terms of, for example, deforestation. There is an example, very fresh example from Slovakia, where the forest management is being moved from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Environment. The protection level of national park is increasing, so it means that that level of forest cutting for using forest as a timber is being decreasing, and there were big protests of people who are actually employed in the forestry sector because they are afraid of losing jobs. So there is a need for this move is really beneficial in terms of climate change, environment protection, but it needs to be accompanied with the financial and support and social support to those who would be losing the jobs, also to building skills and education for shifting to, for example, to tourism and so on.
Thank you. I think that's a great example, and it even talks about the governance change that you just mentioned before. So it actually had everything. So let's move to the next set of slides, and then there will be a lot more time for participation during the 2 breakout groups. Thank you.
Okay, so I am moving now to the entry point, which is the cooperation framework design, which most of you identified as the priority entry point in terms of learning how to mainstream. You would start with confirming environmental climate change risk and opportunities that you have identified in the CCA. That's why it is very important to do it at that stage. The linkages you have also identified in CCA, hopefully adequately. You would translate into the formulation of your theory of change and strategic priorities. And from there, you would move to integrating environment and climate change into the results framework. I would focus on the results framework now. So reflecting environment and climate change in the outcomes, outputs, indicators, and targets. It is very important, and you know the linkages, but at this stage it is very important to assess how environment and climate change and development priorities you have identified mutually affect each other. The slide presents the method where you identify one of your environment or climate change priorities for the country or for the sub-region, which here in this case is to integrate climate change adaptation aspect into the relevant sectors' development policies, plans, and programs. And at the same time, one of your strategic priorities is improved governance, and one of the outcomes is governance system for improved participatory policy planning. I think we would all agree that working on achieving this outcome 1 has a big potential to have a positive effect on climate change adaptation mainstreaming. Because if you improve a way of planning, you make it more integrated and participatory, then there is a bigger chance you have a space to integrate climate change adaptation. You also have to have in mind what are the concerns, and these you can translate into the programs and projects of the UN agencies. Once you have identified that there is really, in this case, it is an opportunity to support a selected climate change or environment issue with implementation of one of your, or with the focus on one of your outputs, outcomes, which is good governance, you have to reflect that in the outputs and in the indicators. There are 2 ways of doing so. In this case, you would either identify output that is specifically focused on environment or climate change. For example, you would say output 1, improve environmental governance, and then have indicators, or you would try to reformulate your existing outputs to make sure that they support integration of environment and climate change. On the screen, you have an example of the output which was taken from one of the CCAs, where the original formulation is written in white, and reference to the environment and climate change was included in green. Here it is mainly related to participatory policy making and planning. And you would, to make sure that you can implement and measure the mainstreaming element, you identify adequate or suitable indicators, like, for example, number of strategic development documents that integrate the environment and climate change as a cross-cutting issue. Of course, this could refer also to gender and other cross-cutting issues. Or, for example, percentage of people with knowledge of their rights to free access to information, participation, decision-making, and access to justice, including in environment. Here we also touch upon the human rights aspect of the development. Now we are at the stage of mainstreaming to the implementation of the cooperation framework, which has two aspects. One aspect is the substance related. So you have to make sure that all those environment and climate change and development priority linkages that you identified in the cooperation framework document are also transferred and reflected in the joint work plans, in the agencies' country programs, documents if they are developing so, and very importantly in the programs and projects. Again, with identifying the right outputs and indicators and targets. Another very important aspect of implementation in terms of mainstreaming is to set up institutional governance and capacity development system for mainstreaming. I will just touch upon the substance related aspect of implementation. Most of the outcome outputs are being implemented through programs and projects of UN agencies, and ideally agencies would develop their own systems for mainstreaming environment and climate change into the programs and projects, which would differ a bit from, at least in level of details, from the guidance I am presenting today. One example is the UNDP social environmental standards process, and I also learned from the list of participants, one of the participants from FAO has mentioned that FAO has also developed the similar process and guidance. But whatever approach agency is decides to take to mainstream into the projects, the key 3 steps should be undertaken. At first, you have to screen your project whether actually it has at all any linkages with environment and climate change, and you have to mainstream at all. If so, you assess what would be the mutual impact of environment and climate change on your project priorities. And if the impact and risks are identified to be considerable, you have to identify how you would manage those risks. And last but not least, all that translation of mainstreaming issues or integrated issues from starting from cooperation framework documents to joint work plans, country program documents or projects would only work if there is effective institutional governance and capacity development system for mainstreaming established. I have identified just a few key elements that such a system should be built of. As you see in the center, very important, and I would say central to this is that that commitment and leadership to mainstream is taken from the top. I think this is really, I would say this would be a must if the mainstreaming should happen on a systematic basis. It is very important who you partner with and who you cooperate and how you involve them. I think already at the stage of the roadmap, you should try to ensure that you have right stakeholders who could bring environment and climate change expertise would be involved. Extremely important is how you set the governance mechanism. We know that that for cooperation framework, The results groups are being established for each strategic priority country identifies or for each outcome. It is important to set governance mechanism in a way that opens up the space for mainstreaming. So for example, if you have a group on environment and climate change, maybe one of the members of that group could take part at the meetings and at the works of the other non-environmental results group. This is only an example. There need to be a continuous capacity building of the UN country team and national counterparts for mainstreaming. This should all be translated, as I have mentioned before, in environment and climate change integrated into joint work plans, programs, and projects. There need to be the corresponding funding framework. So it means that if we identify some interventions in non-environmental outputs and outcomes that could support climate change and environment mainstreaming, I think they should be covered by financial resources. And last but not least, also the monitoring and evaluation, reporting and communication has to include elements of that allow for mainstreaming. The last entry point is monitoring and evaluation. This also has 2 dimensions. You assess the progress and achievement of outputs and outcomes and targets related to environment and climate change, but also very importantly, you assess the effectiveness of your mainstreaming process and system that I have just described. It is important that that mainstreaming elements are embedded in both internal and external evaluation and reviews of cooperation framework. I think here I would end my presentation, and if you have questions, please ask.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. We do have time for just a few questions before we do move into the breakout groups. So on this second set of slides, participants, if you want to use the chat space or raise your hand with a question for Henrietta from the second part, please do so. And of course, we'll have some chance to get into these topics too, particularly the second half of your slides in the breakout rooms. But while people are ruminating on questions, Henrietta, I know you did touch on and discuss that cooperation frameworks, of course, should include at least one outcome results area related to focusing on addressing environment and climate change, but some would argue maybe that's enough, and that there would be no need to address mainstreaming in the non-environmental outcome results areas. But the spirit of mainstreaming, as I understand, is about to really reflect across the non-environmental ones. Can you maybe just elaborate and maybe amplify, I guess, a point you had made earlier?
Yeah, I will try. I think this again has 2 dimensions. One is related to development of the country itself. So there is, as I have mentioned, there is a risk if you don't address climate change and environment issues adequately within one of your development priorities. Let it be increased agricultural productivity or energy independence of the country, health, improved health. There is a risk that those achievement of those development priorities would be hindered by risk that environmental degradation or climate change could pose, and vice versa. And there is also aspect of related to the UN country team and UN agencies programming and implementation as such. I think this approach supports the integrated approach that aligning with SDG framework is calling for. So the UN country team and agencies would actually do as they preach, and also an example of another element, there may be a lower transaction cost of addressing some environment and climate change issues within other development priorities, because you don't have to create separate programs and projects and the whole management around it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the agenda being integrated and indivisible sort of lends itself to the need to mainstream across a number of areas. And of course, that's what we'll be talking about here in the breakout groups in more detail. Henrietta, thank you very much for taking us through the guidance documents. I hope everyone has had a chance to leaf through the documents, as there are many good examples in there, and the annexes include a lot of good case examples in other contexts as well from across the region. Moving on now to the second half, but the second half of the webinar is going to sort of split into two, and we're going to have a chance to, you're going to have a chance to do some more sharing and to learn a little bit about what your peers are doing in the region, and of course get some hands-on sort of practice as well. So we have two rooms that will be set up, and you can choose which room you want to spend the time in. Room number one, we will be focusing on, I'll be facilitating that room, and we'll be focusing on really tools for analyzing risks and linkages that inform both the cooperation framework design and implementation. We will have a case example, a feature case example from Serbia, RCO on that, and then that will be sort of a way to stimulate discussion and sharing amongst everyone in the room about their experiences in using risks or linkages analysis and how that has informed design and implementation phases, and touching on a lot of the aspects that Henrietta mentioned, this how do you mainstream into the non-environmental areas. These are some tools that help to do that. In room number two, Livia will be facilitating that, and she will be featuring a number of case examples, and of course opening the floor for experience from participants in the areas of results frameworks and indicators for the design of frameworks and monitoring and evaluation. There'll be a brief hands-on exercise in working with indicators, identifying indicators, and some Q&A in both sessions. Excellent. Well, I hope everybody had fruitful discussions in each of the breakout rooms. There was a chance to interact at a different level and a different level of detail, and certainly I think that happened in room one, where we got to a level of detail. Just a quick recap on room one, and then Livia will do similar for room two as well before we close out the session. In room one, we were talking about sort of the approaches and tools related to analyzing risks and analyzing links between environment and climate change and development outcomes and vice versa. And how that helped inform the cooperation framework and in terms of strategic priorities, but also how during implementation, those same tools can be used at even a project level. And I think in that regard, we did touch on a few things. Lorenzo, I'll put you on notice here in a bit to come back and maybe you can amplify a few key messages. But a few of the things that I did pick up on, we had one really good question from a colleague from RCO in Kosovo about some of the unintended impacts of achieving environmental objectives. So of course, for a lot of countries looking at decarbonizing as an approach, but sometimes there can be the unintended consequences. And we heard of that also in the just transition example, even in Henrietta's presentation. So the analysis of risks and links at a program project level during implementation really does help with that, because you can be looking at results objectives or at a program project level, and what could be some of those impacts of achieving those program project objectives related to decarbonizing on other results areas. And that becomes then a useful analysis and practical one, because mitigating measures can be put in place. For example, the just economy type measures that Henrietta had mentioned to compensate for lost jobs during the transition, which every country is really experiencing. We did touch on, I think, areas where we got into, things like environment or education and environment and climate change, and how those are important aspects in the mainstream process. We did talk a bit in the room, how I think what I found was interesting too is that in the process of analyzing risks and linkages early on in CCA and into the design process of cooperation frameworks, we engage and ideally engage a number of different stakeholders to get different perspectives and really to get the complexity of the problem understood. And then when you get into the implementation phase, then we're able, it's an opportunity, as I think Lorenzo you mentioned, to loop back to the stakeholders that had been sort of engaged earlier on, and that provides a nice mechanism also for mainstreaming on both sides. So those were a couple of the points that sort of emerged for me from the session. But maybe just Lorenzo, if you just over to you for a bit. Thank you for sharing your experience of Serbia. But what stood out for you in terms of, I guess, your experience, but also what you heard from others?
Thank you very much for this opportunity also to reflect on our process and learn from colleagues. I think what stood out for me is the importance of having a problem tree that starts from the most immediate and apparent risks and links them back up to the root causes, and to have a very large understanding of the deep roots of the unfavorable environmental outcomes that we see. And second, the importance of cross-linkages at all levels, so that we understand these cross-linkages and we kind of preempt the kind of unforeseen outcomes that we might otherwise see. So the unforeseen outcomes of environmental action that is not informed by social priority, that is not informed by human rights approaches. And I think that the example we also had from UNICEF about the children's rights as an important part of the climate change agenda, that was very important. So we need to be aware of these linkages and make sure that we don't overlook them. A third point that stood out for me is then the importance of being bold, of tackling things at a system level as well as at a sectoral level, and that involves finding ways of leveraging climate change throughout the CF, and making those linkages apparent and making those links works in favor of the green transformation. Then coming to the last point, it's about looping back. So understanding what has changed, and both because of our actions or because of external developments, what has changed, and if our action is still relevant in our changed environment, and if not, how can we adapt and respond to the new challenges and new opportunities that we see, and again, the importance of events like the one today, where we have an occasion to reach out back to you, the IBCs, the experts, and the regional offices, get your support, get your expertise, and really, and really empower us to continue to put this in place. So that's it. Over and back.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. So yeah, a fruitful discussion all. Thank you, participants in breakout room 1. Livia, over to you now for room 2, where you guys talked about results frameworks and indicators, and you got even hands-on in your session. So we look forward to hearing from you guys.
Thank you, Darren. So yes, so we had a focus, kind of the ultimate focus was to attempt to design indicators that would account for the mainstreaming aspect of environment, but also gender or other vulnerable groups. So we identified kind of 3 or 4 areas of economic development that would be worthwhile to explore, including agriculture, and especially in terms of water challenges, then issues around wastewater management, energy issues, and mining. But the major focus for us was looking at basically on energy transition and what it means from a country perspective and what it means from a mainstreaming perspective in terms of addressing different types of environmental challenges like climate change, both mitigation in terms of the emissions, but also adaptation in terms of the kind of the infrastructure, and then also issues around the water and linkages with energy transition, biodiversity linkages with energy transition, and then women and kind of vulnerable groups in different locations. So I think we went through designing a set of indicators that are both, I believe, accessible from all types of international and national sources. We also got some good examples from, in the end, from IUCN and other international UN international bodies to actually that collect this type of data. So I think we definitely unpacked the issue of energy transition really well from that point of view, and we identified a whole suite of indicators that cover environment and climate. We haven't had time to pick a presenter for our group, but maybe I was thinking maybe Fiole Tsaka from UN Habitat. Do you want to just briefly jump in and provide some feedback?
Yes, I can't see right now the shared form that we worked on, but maybe I think you did a great recap on the topics that we touched. We touched about the sector of agriculture, so how to shift into a more climate resilient agriculture, mainly through irrigation improvements or crop shifting to more climate resilient ones. Then it was the energy sector, where we touched on, let's say, decarbonizing the sector, increasing the share of renewable energy produced from renewable sources, which would also be an indicator of measuring the progress of that indicator, the percentage increase, but also touching on the energy efficiency in buildings or other sectors. Then it was also skills improvement and finance and technologies, because this energy transition would also need to be accompanied by that, as well as we touched on what would be the government responsibilities or linking to different plans and targets that the country has, let's say reducing emissions through the energy sector, or other targets that the country sets. I think this is what we, maybe other colleagues would have something to add more.
So any like one sentence addition? Okay, so maybe then give a floor to Henrietta, who was also in our group, so, so she can do also a feedback on that, and then we would conclude the summary.
Oh, yeah, maybe I just would add, I was not quick enough to raise my hand to what was presented now. We also touched upon the access to clean energy in remote areas which are off grid, and just came to my mind that we placed as an indicator the area itself, remote areas that have access, but now it came to my mind that it could be related to health. I don't know if that could be, of course, measurable, but indicator could be in terms of decreased, like in terms of health problems related to indoor air pollution, yeah, if that could be measured in those areas. But otherwise, I think we captured many aspects. We also touched upon the governance issue very briefly. For example, when we, which is again less obvious area, where we, for example, looked at the climate change impact of water availability for different sectors, which to reflect to the situation of water scarcity would require changes in the management of the natural resources, also, for example, introduction of or improvement of integrated water resource management.
Yes, thank you. So I'm not sure, Henrietta, if you have like few sentences to kind of sum up maybe the whole workshop experience, but really just two, and then we can move to a closing.
You mean the whole work, the whole?
Yeah,
training?
any feedback you want to give?
I cannot react on the first working group, but I think the second working group was very active, and we came with many good examples of integrated indicators. I think we would, if we had more time, we could relate more to issues like human rights and health and education, which would present even more integrated approach to provide the indicators for mainstreaming environment and climate change. But overall, I think it was a good exercise.
Thank you. Darren, do you want to jump in?
Just a thank you to participants in both rooms for rolling your sleeves up, working on exercises, sharing experiences, posing questions. I think we did have a good look at, I think, the design and implementation aspects and some of the particular approaches and tools that were in the guidance document. And I think one good comment, one really helpful comment for both rooms that was raised was that there's no. A lot of times the use of a lot of the approaches and tools and guidance documents, it is more of an organic sort of process from the part of the country team. It's not that everything is applied formally as laid out by a country experience or in a guidance document. So I think it was quite nicely brought up in our room that application of what you hear from other colleagues and read in guidance books has to obviously be contextualized and adapted and revised to kind of fit your timing and circumstances and the like. So I thought that was an important point. But thank you very much to everyone. Henrietta, did you have just a little sort of recap on that last point, and then we'll move to our closing segment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that what we presented and the whole guidance and approaches and tools, it's actually not a rocket science, because there is a lot of expertise within UN country teams on all development priority issues. That it is more about shifting the mindsets and setting up the process, which I was touching upon at the end of my presentation. So I think this would be very important to commit and to create a system for mainstreaming, which may not be easy, but as I say, it's important.
Very good. Thank you very much, Henrietta. Livia, back to you, and to Sarah, I guess, back to you for thought, and then to Sarah.
Thank you. And yes, thank you all for the participation during the working groups. I think it was really great to get your different feedback. And also special thank you to Henrietta for your suggestions now and during the whole workshop. And on behalf of ISD, I'm really, really happy that so many of you joined and actively participated in the working groups. And we are really grateful for your commitment. Also, I would like to thank my colleague Darren for his efforts to managing all these and the slides and everything. And we are very happy that how the workshop went, and we will looking forward for the last workshop that will happen for the second workshop for another region. And so if you have any questions to ask, there will be a follow-up, but if you have any specific questions to ask, please feel free to reach out and we will definitely try to respond. Thank you and have a nice afternoon, morning, so whichever time zone you are. And now over to Sarah.
Yes, thank you very much, Livia. Dear colleagues, on behalf of IBC on Environment and Climate Change, I would like to warmly thank you for your participation and contribution to this training. Supporting countries and UNCTs in the environmental dimension of cooperation framework and common country analysis is one of the three main pillars of IBC work. elaboration of mainstreaming guidance responds to the request by resident coordinators. More specifically, RCs requested IBC support in identifying key regional environmental and climate change risks, challenges, and opportunities, and how to integrate them in the UNSDCFs. This two-part training webinar was developed based on this request, and we very much appreciated your interest and active participation today. Since the new guidance for cooperation framework was developed in 2019, many UN country teams finalized the new cycle of cooperation framework. And some examples of good practices and experiences of mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation framework processes were included in the mainstreaming guidance document. And in today's training, we heard the example from Serbia, and we would like to thank again the RCO Serbia for sharing the experience. We hope such experience sharing was very useful for all of you, and especially for those UNCTs that are now rolling out new cooperation framework. And we encourage the RCOs and UNCTs to use the mainstreaming guidance at the relevant stages of cooperation framework processes they are now currently on. And if there is a need to have a follow-up support on specific environment and climate change issues to mainstream at the country level, or any of the stages of programming cycle, IBC stands ready to further support. And such request could be sent to us via DCO. So for your information, the event was recorded, as you may have noticed, and all materials, including a summary report, will be available in the coming weeks, and we will share the link with you, with all participants. The information and material will be also uploaded on IBC website, and we would like to also take in this opportunity to ask you to circulate further this information to your colleagues in country team. We will also email you a certificate of participation in appreciation of your engagement in today's training, or also for some of you who also attended the first part of the training. We would very much welcome your feedback on the workshop. In a minute, Darren will explain the evaluation questionnaire to which we would like to receive your feedback. And such evaluation and suggestions will be very important for us to improve future events and workshops. And once more, I would like to thank again our facilitators from IASD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, and also our main mainstreaming consultant, Henrietta Martinekova, for designing and delivering today's training. And I would like to also thank my IBC colleagues, especially the colleagues in the core team from UNEC, UNESCO, and UNEP, who have worked very hard behind this workshop. So thank you again, all dear colleagues, for your continued engagement with our IBC, and we are very much looking forward to continuing cooperating with you. Thank you very much.